One of the questions that kind of arose from the time when I presented her manuscript was why sex robots are being manufactured in the shape of humans. Who would like to give the first answer?
So I invented the real doll back in 1997, and the initial creation was not actually intended to be a sexual device at all. I was simply wanting to make a very realistic posable doll, and the public response was very much slanted toward this idea of making it anatomically. So that's what I've been doing now for over 2 decades. And as I became more interested in artificial intelligence and robotics and being able to integrate those with the initial doll creation, it's just kind of following suit. For me personally, I don't tend to put a tremendous amount of focus on the sexual aspect. I think that's more of an aside to the idea of creating a synthetic form of life. And I do think there's great value for certain people who may find a higher level of companionship and potentially sexual partnership with these robots and dolls. So I don't have a problem with that concept at all.
Yes, I think in Japan, which is the country probably most oriented towards the use of robots in the world, in Japan the feeling is very much that people enjoy interacting with robots or automata if they're in a human-like form rather than in some other form. This is, I think, what's been established for quite a long time. And I think it's natural. I don't think there's anything wrong in it at all. I think that when we think about having some sort of artificial companion, we want it to appear to be in the likeness of something that we recognize. I mean, Sony brought out a robotic dog called Aibo, and they sold a few thousand of those, and then they took it off the market. Now it's back on the market, and a lot of people actually regard it as a kind of artificial dog companion. So I think that doesn't only apply to humans. I think it's that we want to interact with something that we can identify with.
Thanks. The same question? I mean, it's almost, I don't know, it's a bit of a non-question. Of course, these particular sex dolls, I mean, this is a doll rather than a robot, I'd say, more. They are fetish objects, and this is a slightly different question talking about the actual possibility of an interaction, an artificial interaction with a robot that you think can possibly harbour or give a simulacrum of harbouring feelings for you. So there are slightly different questions here, but to the fetishization of the female form is, of course, just pornography, and there's nothing wrong with that, but we're not really talking about that question specifically. But what is very obvious that seems to be being avoided in all of this conversation is that these dolls are always predominantly female. I know that they do make male dolls, and I know that there are some people that are interested in having male dolls. But you're either going to have the female doll, whole body, or you're going to have the phallic object. Because I know in, I don't know if Matt's, is it your Real Doll website, I think I saw that you had the full bodies of the females and then just the penises of for the male option. So of course, I mean, we're talking about partial objects here. We're not talking about the same thing from the female side as from the male side. Why do people like that? Because women have always been partial objects, and they will always, whilst we're fetishizing their form, we're not really talking about an actual relationship with an artificial intelligence. It's a slightly different question.
In that case, when we think about consent and artificial being that we find as a companion, In this scenario where we take away the human form and we actually create something which is a piece of our imagination, but we still resonate with it in intimate setting, how would we then, do you think, would approach the question of consent when the human form is being taken out of the equation? But what we develop, we think, is conscious to a certain degree. And again, when do we think what we created is conscious? Because nobody really has exact definition of what life or consciousness is.
I don't think it matters whether it's in a human form or in the form of an elephant or a carrot. Like, it's not the person, and it cannot consent. It can only give somebody the illusion of wanting or not wanting to have sex. And let's be honest, lots of people that have and use sex robots have fantasies of having very non-consensual sex, of course, but that's what fantasies are. You can do whatever you like with a sex robot. That's why people have them. And the question of consent is completely, I think, irrelevant to the question of sex robots, because we're not actually talking about real artificial intelligence. And the ethical questions more bear on how we could talk about the sex robot industry in relation to the real sex industry, and actual sex workers and people who actually have to work in these fields and suffer or not, according to how sex robots affect their livelihoods. So there's so many ethical questions here, but I'm not sure we're asking the right ones, particularly in this conversation about sex robots.
What do you think would be the right question to ask?
Well, I mean, what about the ethics?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, there are so many problems with the idea that we're all kind of laughing about these figures, and we all came in and we all wanted to grab her tits, and I know you did, actually, but but we do that because, of course, it becomes a joke and becomes this so divorced from. We think it's so divorced from real life, but actually, it's something more sinister than that. And of course, yes, we can have this idea of a sort of utopian technology where everybody has the ability to indulge their fantasies in whichever way they like. But let's face it, your fantasies are very much to do with real everyday human interactions. So what you want to do with a sex robot is going to be something probably along the lines with what you'd like to do in real life. It's not a whole different universe that we're inventing. You don't kind of invent. I want like a tentacled, zebra, and that's my fantasy, and I'm going to do it. We don't actually do that. Most people's fantasies are quite predictable, and they're usually not very nice.
I don't quite agree that consent isn't an important aspect of this question, because we have people like Kathleen Richardson, who started a campaign against sex robots, and one of her main arguments was that sex robots objectify women, and because there is no possibility of the robot consenting, that someone having sex with a robot is committing rape, and that's being used by her consistently as one of the platforms for arguing that sex robots should be made illegal. And I think that argument is nonsense. And as I've said, as robots become more and more human-like, I think it's only natural that we should address issues of consent, because the relationships that people will have with them are reflective of the relationships that people have with other people. So I think consent is an important question. Now we laugh at, you're quite right saying that we laugh at products like this now. Some people laugh at the question of consent, but the laughter will change as they become more and more sophisticated. I remember going to a completely different subject. I remember in the early days of computer chess, we who understand the game quite well would laugh whenever a computer played a game that we saw. We would laugh at how primitive it was, how it had no idea at all. And one of my colleagues said at a conference, he said something very perceptive. He said, today chess masters come to watch these games to laugh. Soon they will come out of interest, and then they will come to learn. And he was exactly right, because the development in artificial intelligence came to the point where chess programs could play better than the world's best human. And similarly, AI and robotics will, in time, and it's only a few decades away, come to the point where we can create artificial beings that are so lifelike that people will enjoy their company, enjoy a conversation with them, find them emotionally appealing. A lot of people will fall in love with them, many people will have sex with them, and some people will marry them.
Matt, would you like to add anything to this?
I did want to add that we do also sell full body male dolls as well as female. So we're not simply making all female dolls. The fact remains that they are a bigger seller, and we are actually in business to make money and sell things and make a profit. So, but I did want to point that out. And also, I do agree that consent is vitally important to the equation that leads up to sex. And I think there's a very big misconception when people think about the people who must have dolls like mine, that they must be buying these because they don't want to deal with consent. But quite to the contrary, all of the people that I've met in the years I've been doing this, very kind, quiet people who simply are looking for some kind of companionship and have not been able to find it with human beings. And the doll for them is something that's very special. They treat it better than probably most people treat their partners. So there's really not an element there of people who are mistreating or otherwise, using the doll to act out rape fantasies and such. This is just not a reality. So I think that it's very important to acknowledge that and put that out there, because I have the unique position of having gotten to know a lot of people who actually buy dolls and collect dolls like this.
Okay, thank you. But if we start thinking about robots in the shape of like any type of shape which is non-human, and then thinking of those robots as devices which already have artificial intelligence in them, and imagine that this device has complete consciousness, like human being, like it's full on developed to the standard that we find acceptable, but it doesn't have human form. How do you think would then question of consent, how would it matter and what would it be? Because we think of consent when we actually think of human being, with something that resembles ourselves, and when we kind of try to associate how we would feel in that position. But when this object does not resemble human, but is completely conscious as human, how would you think consent would change then?
We're talking about the question of what would happen in a future, an imagined future, when an artificial intelligence is supposedly in a position to consent and has, and now we're imputing it with actual consciousness and intelligence, which is nowhere near anything that we have at the moment, and definitely none of these creatures are in that position. The question of the kinds of interactions that people have who use these dolls, which I have no problem with people using those dolls, and it's not to criticize the people, but you must acknowledge that the point of a sex robot is that it is something that does not have its own free will, and it is not making decisions, and it's not thinking about you, and it can't suffer, and you can put it in a box, and you can do whatever you like. And yes, you may be in love with it, and you may treat it as, and you may project your fantasies on it, because that's what we do with human beings. We project our fantasies on them, and we imagine that they think things that we want them to think. In this case, these dolls do not do that. So there is a fundamental difference between having the fantasy of something that you compare to when you watch Blade Runner, for example, and you think, oh, that, imagine that, a holographic AI who could fall in love with me. But it's not the same thing. And so the reason why it makes a difference that these dolls look like fantasy pornographic women is because they're playing into a fantasy about what people want to, what type of interactions people want to have with these dolls. So it's kind of misleading to think that we're talking about an actual question of a relationship, because it's not a relationship. I'm not saying that in some imagined future we can't have that. Yes, I'm very interested in these speculative ideas, but these are not relationships. So if they genuinely were artificial intelligences which weren't in human forms, and they could consent, and they do have ideas, and they do have, okay, we could talk about that. But again, I don't see any. Show me one. I'd like to meet one.
Perhaps it's been developed behind the closed doors.
Yeah, I wish there were.
Cool. Do any speakers have questions to themselves? I mean, to other speakers? Do you have questions to Isabel or to Matt? Is there anything that you would like to discuss with other presenters?
Yes, I'd like to ask Matt a question. Amongst the customers you have for your full male dolls, what is the percentage of men and women amongst those customers?
For the male dolls, it's probably about 50-50, and in some cases couples, and in some cases people buying it for completely non-sexual purposes. And I did want to touch on something that she just said about a man being with a doll not being a relationship. And I think in a very high level, yes, that's correct. However, if that quote relationship is making this individual happy and giving them the same sense of fulfillment that all of us have in our quote traditional relationships, then who are we to judge, and how can we not define it as a relationship? If they found something in that doll or in that robot that makes them feel more whole and fulfilled, isn't that the point of a relationship in the first place? So certainly not saying this is the norm, but I definitely think there's something to be looked at and evaluated a little further, especially because really no studies have been done and there's really no data to support this argument one way or the other. But I have personal observations that make me say these things, that I've seen people go from being extremely depressed and lonely to feeling like they have a wholeness to their life and feeling happy to go home at the end of the day. And they treat and dote on these dolls. And for me, it's very simple, making them happy. And so I think that's a good thing.
Yes, I agree completely with what you said, Matt. I'd also point out that the word relationship is not exclusively the type of relationships that we know and experience with other humans. For example, I love my cat, and my cat loves me. Now, I know my cat loves me because it behaves in very, very affectionate ways. My cat also loves my wife, and my wife loves my cat. So there are all sorts of different types of relationship. And just because we're talking about relationships with an object which has no personhood and no genuine emotions, that doesn't mean that it can't be a satisfying relationship, as you said. And I've always argued that the main point of sex robots is to provide sexual and emotional companionship for people who cannot themselves find good relationships with other humans. And I think, therefore, that you're doing a very good public service, Matt.
Thank you very much for that.
Lots of things make people happy. Lots of objects make people happy. Lots of ways of interacting, simulations of interactions make people happy. They're not all bad. They're not all morally wrong or ethically wrong. There are many questions we could raise. It's not a relationship. It's not the same thing as a human relationship. No, we have to be clear about what we're talking about here. But if there is a therapeutic use for people to want to have non-human companions, I'm not saying that in itself is wrong, but it's not the same thing. And it's not... You have to approach it from a perspective of trying to understand what type of interaction is actually going on, because it's really not a reciprocal interaction. So yes, they can have a fantasy about something that they think they're getting and it's making them whole, and that is fantastic. And if it makes people happy, it makes people happy. But it's not the same question as whether we're talking about the possibility of an AI actually loving you back. That's a different question, which we don't really seem to be making the distinction between at the moment.
Cool. Shall we open the question to the floor? Because I think there are some hands that would like to. Okay.
I just have a quick question, maybe an analogy. If you envision a future where, fine, you agree that maybe loving a sex robot and using it for sexual gratification or theoretical use cases might not suffice enough to form a relationship around it. But in a future where a companion loses their lover, and there's a possibility that with AI and more future progress in computing and neurology, you could implant the same profile of a companion into a sex robot. Maybe not a sex robot, a robot into an android who could replicate a lost companion and then progress that relationship. Would that be something of consideration to change the whole view about it?
Well, I'd be more interested about the question of implanting a chip into a human, because that's what's actually happening at the moment, and people are working on those questions. And that is a genuine question. That is a genuine question about AI, about when actual artificial intelligence is merged with human neurological systems. At what point are we still talking about a human subject? And I think we're getting close to the point where these kind of things might be happening. And when that starts happening, and then when we start having the idea of being able to genuinely program parts of people's brains and parts of people's subjectivity, then we are going to be talking about different questions, ethical questions about consent and relationships, and how much you can administer your own fantasy in another human being. That will be a genuine question. I don't think we are at that point with these kind of robots at the moment yet.
Hi guys, great talks from everyone. I was wondering about the practical application of sex dolls for people with special needs or diagnoses that might mean they might not have the ability to have personal interactions, or like physical disabilities where they can't have engaged, or they don't engage in much sexual activity. And for the real goals, the real doll guy, I've forgotten your name, sorry, whether you've actually had any kind of practical application on that sense, and then for the two people in the front, kind of like the theoretical kind of ethics around that as well.
Yeah, I can tell you that we do have a considerable percentage of clients who have disabilities, whether they're physical, emotional, or mental. Many PTSD, people who have come back from very traumatic events and are really unable to have a normal relationship with a human being, but they still have this this feeling of need for that. I do think there's a tremendous use for the dolls, and moving forward with the robots for therapeutic purposes, and certainly not limited to sex. I think that there's a funny thing that humans do where we feel like we have to assign a word to things. So we call it a sex robot, therefore we limit the definition of what it is to just a sex device. And I think as these robots and AI move forward, and it's going to happen exponentially, this is really going to be, the explosion of the new technology. I don't think it will be as easy to define them in these types of ways, like, a vacuum robot or a sex robot. I think they're just going to become this new type of intelligence that we will all be interacting with in different ways. And certainly many of those ways can be therapeutic and can help people in need. So I think there is far more positive than negative to be offered with all of this technology.
I think definitely there is, of course, real therapeutic uses for these devices, as Matt says. Also, there is the issue that these kinds of robots have been developed to, I want to say, treat pathologies, but also not just treat pathologies, to indulge pathologies, because we've got robots being developed in the shape of children for paedophilic use. Now, some people are saying, well, this can be used for therapeutic and beneficial usages for treating people with these issues. I mean, people have written a lot about this over the past few decades. This is not my area of research, and it's not something that I would necessarily want to venture into to talk about, because I think there's enormous ethical problems surrounding it. There's a book written in the 80s by Isabel Millar called Overexposed, Perverting Perversions. And this writer, Isabel Millar, he's a philosopher, and he basically went undercover and went into a clinic in America where they were doing aversion therapy for people, for sex criminals and for people with antisocial sexual behavior, put it that way. And what he found is that they were using all sorts of simulations in order to monitor and measure the physical responses that these people who were, I don't know, in police custody or on waiting for trials or whatever, to see how they responded to various different images that were illegal. And what he found was, I'm sorry, maybe this is slightly off topic, but he found that by kind of inducing all of these fantasies, it got into a very strange territory where it wasn't really clear who was the pervert. Was the pervert the person being forced to watch unpleasant images or violent images, or was it the psychologists who were measuring every pulse or every bead of sweat that came off their heads? And the long and the short of it is that he found that it was a very tricky and complex area when you start to try and administer people's fantasies and expose them and put them, and measure them, because you're probably going to find lots of unpleasant things that you didn't really want to know about yourself and about the people that you're measuring. But the point being is that, all sex is pathological. Some is more pathological than others. And with the sex robot, what we get is an absolute explosion of the possibilities, and they are not necessarily bad, but they're not necessarily good. They are neutral. They can be anything. And what our responsibility is as humans, who are still ethical, legal persons fully, is to be very, very careful and very, very specific about how we use these technologies and for what purposes and what possibilities we can make happen with them. So I think it's a question of being really clear about what we want from these kind of objects and who they can help and who they don't help.
How far away are you from being able to produce sex robots that look unrecognizable to human beings? And will you stop at that point, or will you continue?
I think in some ways that's not that far off, but in other ways it seems so far off that I can't predict. I think AI in particular has a huge amount of work that remains. Even the smartest AI on the planet is probably about as bright as an earthworm. Something like a self-driving car may seem fantastical, but it's really not intelligence. It's just math. So real AI, the kind that everyone seems to be sort of concerned with when they ask about this issue of consent with robots, that's really far off. So the physical nature of the robots in terms of the engineering and the the underlying structures and machinery that make it move, and the skin technology and the appearance of it and how that part to me seems more tangible than the system that controls it. So I would say probably within 5 to 10 years, the appearance of the robots is going to drastically improve. The AI may start to approach something in the mammal category, but I don't see necessarily human-like intelligence. And as such, I don't think we can even consider the idea of human-like self-awareness, which is really the big can of worms that people worry about with AI. So that's a little bit further out. But I do think the engineering side and the artistic side will come a long way in the next 10 years.
I want to add for myself. So, from your point of view, when we actually get that moment when we have superhuman-like, unrecognizable robots with fully developed AI, what's next? Where do we push further from that? If, for example, in that scenario, what is next? We start to assign them like some kinks and some other fetishes that they can desire themselves. Like where else to go after that moment when that robot becomes unrecognizable intellectually and physically?
Well, I think humans always come up with the next thing. So I'm sure we will continue in other directions as well. But I think that the core technology we're talking about here, which is robotics and artificial intelligence, this is going to become a sort of fundamental foundation for a lot of new things. It's going to become a thing that right now seems outlandish to us to consider the idea of interacting with human-like robots in our everyday lives because we don't see them very often. But that might not be the case in 5 years. We might start to see them when we go to a Starbucks. They might be serving coffee. We might see them when we go to a department store. They might be telling us which direction to go. We might see them in our own homes, or other people's homes that we know. And little by little, they'll become more and more present. And as such, they'll become more and more accepted, just like a lot of other things in society. So what will they be for? I think this is the funny questions that people ask. What is the robot for? Maybe it's not for anything in particular. Maybe it's just a new type of existence that we can work with them instead of fearing them, instead of worrying about the implications of them. They are a direct reflection of ourselves. We are creating the technology that will allow us to probably go in unseen directions in the coming years.
Great, but that also links to what Tanya was saying in her manuscript, that not necessarily the current look is serving the function. So, as you said earlier, that we will see robots performing different functions. Perhaps there are more functions in a companion that can be apart from visual look, because what would you define as the main functions of a current product that you're manufacturing?
For me, I think a lot of people tend to focus on, it's a sex doll. I don't look at it that way, because most of the people that buy it have thought about it long and hard, and they become quite involved in the process of the creation of the doll. And once they get it, they become quite attached to it, more than you would, a sort of product that you would buy off the shelf. So for me, I think the main function of the product that I make is companionship. I think it alleviates some kind of loneliness or empty space that people may feel in their lives. And for me, I'm proud to say I create a thing that does that. And whatever I can do to add to it is what I'm doing. So adding AI and robotics to it is only to sort of augment the existing thing that I already made, which is a very human-like figure that can occupy a space in your life and in your home and somehow feel kind of like a person for those people who don't necessarily want or can't find a companion that's human.
Okay, thank you. Do you have more questions from the crowd? Okay.
Yeah, a quick question. Do any of you currently or personally envisage owning a doll or AI device to fulfill either an emotional or physical intimacy aspect in your lives?
Well, I have a wife and 6 kids, so I don't know if I have room left in my life for a robot. And I don't like to take my work home with me either. But I do look at the AI and the robot kind of more like a friend. So I do see it as a physical idea of a character more than a product. So that's where I'm at with it.
For myself, the idea of having an emotional relationship with a robot is something that will never happen, simply because even if I live to be much, even if I live another 30, 40 years, I would always be saying to myself, well, I know how that's done, and I wouldn't be able to accept it as a reality. But what I would accept is if there are sex robots that are very human-like in their actions, in their conversation, very advanced robots, the kind of robots that I envisage being made by Matt's company within about 30 years. I would want, if I'd seen reviews of them and I'd seen interviews with people who'd used them and found them to be very satisfying sexually, I would want to experiment probably just once to find out what it was like to experience it for myself. I think that's quite a natural wish for me to have, given that I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about this. But for me to have a personal relationship with a robot, I don't think is something that will ever happen. I'll stick with my cat and my wife.
No, I wouldn't have any interest in a sexual interaction with a robot, either male or female or of non-human form. It doesn't have any appeal for me personally. You can ask my boyfriend. Maybe he. No, I don't. I just literally don't. But if I'm not saying that I would discount the idea of being able to interact with a genuine AI in the future. But again, we're just not there. I mean, one of the interesting questions is talking about whether you can bring back people who have died through kind of holographic, which is a simulation, but nevertheless you could still have the kind of experience of being with them. And my brother often says about our mum that he would like to, even though he would know, because she died years ago, but that she would be able to, he could bring her back, and that he could be able to have a talk with her, even though he knew that she wasn't really there. And then I say, well, yeah, but wouldn't that be a bit spooky and uncanny? He said, yeah, but no, because then I would at least be able to, feel that I could have a simulation of her being there. And, those kinds of technologies, I think we probably will have. And I don't think that they're necessarily, they're not necessarily the same sort of question, but I don't think it's going to be a bad thing, and I think we will be able to use those kinds of things. But in terms of having sex with something that I know is an artificial intelligence, no, I just don't. I think it's. Look, I'm not going to speak for all women, but I'm pretty sure this is a very gendered question here, because I'm pretty sure that most women are not particularly interested in having sex with a sex robot. Anyone who wants to disagree with me, maybe?
Not disagree. I'll just say that, for example, if you ask me, I'm a very curious person. I would definitely do it just for the sake of interest. Because, you have to try everything in life since we live once. Maybe more, but we don't know. But I also think, I would personally love to have, a robot of myself. It would ease my life so much. A lot of, things that I, just physically have no time to do, I would give it to her. I'm oh, deal with it. And if you think the way to get it done, it would be sort of bad, it will be her decision, it will take a certain responsibility off my shoulders. And I think in terms of, would it actually make people, female, for example, feel like they've been objectified? I don't think so necessarily, because it can actually help female to actually do what they actually want to do, rather than being restrained by some specific thoughts or other things that they might be entitled to do by the other people. So I think it's double-ended stick, and there is no one answer to this question. But I think David wants to add. You have my...
Sorry. Yes, this is an interesting point. I think that women are going to be at least as interested as men will be, when sophisticated sex robots are on the market that can deliver orgasms when completely on demand. Look, for example, at the number of women who buy vibrators. I don't think women are at all, in general, I don't think that masses of women are afraid or totally dismissive of using technology for sexual purposes. And I mean, it's interesting. I was trying to do a count earlier, but I never finished it. I think that, am I right that there are more women here than men tonight? If not, it's very close. I gave one talk in Toronto when I was debating Kathleen Richardson at an event there a couple of years ago. And after the talk, 20 people came up to me to say that they really believed that what I was saying would happen, and they thought it would be a good thing. And of those 20 people, 16 were women. So I don't think women are going to be totally disinterested. I think women want good sex as much as men want good sex. And I think if a robot gets the publicity of being a great lover, I think women will be queuing up from here to Los Angeles to buy one.
Yeah, also what is interesting, I just want to point out from our previous event, which was in October, that we had mainly like female presenters, and I think the main point that all of them were making is that female love technology and sex no less than men, and what they love more is actually other sensory explorations, functions that the technology can deliver. So not necessarily the ideal robotic lover for the female would be in the shape of a man. Perhaps there are many other sensory stimuli that we can develop through robotics and through AI that can actually fulfill much more pleasurable sensations and functions to the body as male as female and a male. So I think there is much more also to be developed in sex tech, which doesn't have necessarily a female body for male pleasure as well. It just hasn't been, for some reasons, been touched so far.
We kind of talk about this happening as a fact, but sort of two questions really. One would be, do you guys feel if we have a sex robot that we should be putting an AI, a consciousness into that? Is that morally correct? And I suppose to Matt specifically, if there was a AI, would you put that in one of your dolls, or would you have any sort of hesitations or issues with doing that?
The idea of true AI inhabiting a lifelike robot is obviously pretty high on the list of things that I think are not only interesting but well worth pursuing. And there's an aspect of the artistic side of me that it's hard to always know why you're driven to do something. But yes, I'm definitely driven to do that. And by the way, to comment on the last thing you were talking about, there's probably about 5 to 10 times more inquiries from women about the male robot than we ever got about the male dolls. So the fact that he can talk and remember things and have some kind of really simple conversation apparently is heading in the right direction. So I do think there will be a higher demand from females for the male robot once we get it to where we are actually able to deliver on something that would make sense.
Thank you. 2 more questions? Okay.
David, this is a question for you, because you have a very sort of optimistic and utopian vision of a future perfect robot lover who sort of imbued with all the information of millennia, everything you could possibly be sort of instilled with. I'm just wondering, obviously that's relies on the data set that's used and who's created that data set and cleaned it and what's being put into him. How would you envisage that we could avoid sort of problematic biases that a lot of, sort of, like, for example, I think it was either Microsoft AI or Google AI had, and like the biases with sort of like dating apps have some like sort of heteronormative kind of like mainstream skews, which sort of completely sort of, sorry, this is really boring, or like, they just kind of like erase outliers, including kinks. What do you think that? How would do you think ethically we could create something like a law or something that would safeguard those, so there wouldn't, so it would be this, utopian lover, like fully automated luxury sex robot, as Isabel said?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think obviously there are all sorts of possibilities of robots behaving badly, not just because the wrong data is used or because of a design fault, but also because of malicious intervention by people who have the skills to hack into a robot's technology and control the robot. And you're absolutely right that there should be laws to deal with such situations, but it's the whole process of developing laws is very slow, as I mentioned earlier. And I think this is a very big fear, a genuine fear of mine, that the speed of growth of AI and the achievements of AI is going to be so fast that it will completely outstrip the possibilities of governments to consider what kind of laws they need to bring in to deal with the robot future. I mean, just look at what's happening with drones, for example. I gave a talk in Holland, in The Hague, about 18 months ago, which included in the audience some people from the Dutch Ministry of Defense. And I was arguing that governments should immediately be looking at ways that technology, including drones, and especially drones in some ways, could be used to damage society severely. And it was very interesting. The people from the Dutch Ministry of Defense poo-pooed what I was saying and said, it's not going to happen, or it's so far off. And then within a year we have this incident at Gatwick Airport where drones closed the airport and cost huge amounts of money and caused tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of passengers to miss their flights because the airport was closed. And that's just drones wandering around the airspace, not doing any damage. Imagine what will happen when terrorists get hold of a drone they can buy for £200 and add to it a little receptacle of rice and fly it into the middle of Trafalgar Square. I think governments have been far too lax in the way in which they're addressing, or rather not addressing, these problems. And I think your point is a very valid point. Something needs to be done. There needs to be a Greta Thunberg of the AI world, I think.
Thank you. And the final question for tonight?
Hey there. So it seems like we're a far way off kind of simulating a human in the AI space, but it seems we're like really close to simulating something like a human physically. And I guess I just want to know, like, what do you think the ethical implications are of someone non-consensually creating duplicates of real living people? So sort of a sex doll of a celebrity that hasn't given any consent. I just say consent because earlier in that tour there was some porn stars that were like, yeah, awesome, let's make some duplicates of myself. But I guess everyone else in the world would probably be pretty uncomfortable with that, right?
I've been obviously doing this a long time, and I've always had the same sort of policy on that, which is I will not make a copy of another human without express consent from them. I've been approached more times than you can imagine, make a copy of this actress, or here's a picture of my girlfriend that left me, or some even a dead celebrity. And I've never touched that, because for me that's an ethical line. I just don't think it would be right to make copies of someone without their permission, their personal permission, dead or alive. It's just for me that's not a gray area. It's pretty black and white. So I would never do that.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful, and I hope everybody learned something new from this. Thank you so much, Matt, for taking your time and joining us for this panel discussion. Thank you for our speakers to being here present. Let's give them all large applause.